Other agencies have also found great deals of savings of time and money. One would be the Postal Service, which is the largest employer in the United States government on the civilian side and has almost 1 million people working for it. And of the 1 million people who work at the post office, about 20,000 of them file lawsuits against each other or complaints for disputes in the workplace. Employees suing their managers, employees suing each other for discrimination or for workplace misconduct. These cases are hugely expensive, and to use the litigation method costs between $5,000 for one that's quickly handled and up to $75,000 per case for one that goes all the way up through a trial, an appeal. Can cost $75,000. In the Postal Service, they have 20,000 of these cases every year, so it was costing them a fortune to handle these through adjudication. They put an ADR program involving mediation in, and the results have been exemplary. They bring a mediator in very quickly, within 2 weeks of the filing of the complaint. They require that the parties sit down with each other with a mediator and talk about the dispute. 80% of the time the case is settled, and the average case takes only 4 hours compared to a year or 2 years to litigate it. They find that 90% of the parties are satisfied or very satisfied with the results, and this is a much higher rate. The parties at the end of trials in the post office are satisfied or very satisfied 45% of the time. So they're twice as happier at the end of ADR. And perhaps even more importantly, there have been fewer new complaints every year as a result of mediation. The first year, there were about 20,000 complaints. Mediation was implemented, and the following year there were 24% fewer complaints. And the year after that, there were 20% fewer than that. And it has tapered off somewhat since then, but we think it's because the parties are talking to each other, they're realizing the importance of what they say and do in the workplace, and they are getting along better with one another. Some tricky things in the government, some things make it more difficult for us to use mediation in the government context. Some government cases involve principles that we can't compromise. If the tax department says you owe a certain amount in tax, you have to pay it. You can't really say, well, what if I agree to settle it and pay you less? The principle requires the result. We also need precedent in certain cases. We need to act uniformly across the cases that are happening in one part of the country with other parts of the country. So that limits us in settlement. But maybe the biggest difficulty we have in the government is a difficulty I think is faced throughout the country and perhaps throughout the world. There's still kind of a glory in doing a trial. Litigators are idealized. We have more television shows. We have more movies about famous lawyers and famous trial lawyers and not about famous mediators. I was a trial lawyer myself, a litigator for close to 10 years at the Justice Department. And if I won a trial in my work, I'd come back to the office. They'd pat me on the back. They'd shake my hand. We'd have a meeting, and I would tell them about how wonderful it was and how I was victorious. They'd sometimes give me a cash bonus at the end of the year for winning. In contrast, if I settled a lawsuit, they'd say, that's great. Here's another lawsuit for you. Now you need to work on that one. Much less excitement in trials. And I think it's similar in the government and outside of the government as well. Some laws have helped us overcome these difficulties in the federal government. In the progression of what can laws do to increase ADR, first thing they can do is permit it. And the initial laws in the government allowed us to use ADR when there had been questioned before. The next phase of laws would be to encourage it, and that's about where we are now. A lot of my job is promoting the use of mediation, encouraging people to use it, helping them. The final phase is requiring people to use mediation, and we have had that in some isolated courts in various parts of the country, but for the most part the government has not required people to use mediation. We make it a voluntary process. There's a website you can visit that covers all of the ADR in the government at www.adr.gov, which I put together to summarize many of these laws and statutes. Let me give you just a couple of examples of cases where we've used ADR to show how it can work in the government. The first is maybe the biggest case where we have used mediation, the Microsoft lawsuit where the government sued Bill Gates and the Microsoft company for antitrust violations. This actually went through mediation twice. The first time was with a federal judge who was extremely distinguished judge and one of the world's experts in antitrust law, Richard Posner, but I think even he would agree he was not one of the most experienced mediators ever, and the mediation did not succeed that time. But we had another chance, and we came back with the mediator. This time I got to have a say in who the mediator was, and my biggest decision on that was to have a professional mediator who does ADR full-time for a living, and we ended up hiring one of the founders of Jams and Disputes many years ago, Professor now Eric Green. He sat down with the parties, and the case, the Justice Department's part of the case, was resolved. And it was a great success for us. The trial, there was litigation involving 20 lawyers at the Justice Department. We think even more lawyers on Microsoft's side, because if anybody has more money than the government, it would be Microsoft. And they litigated this through 2.5 or 3.5 actually years. There was a trial, there was an appeal, it was sent back for another trial, and we were barely further along than when we started 3.5 years earlier. Sitting down with the mediator, the parties resolved the case in 2 weeks. We're delighted with that result. It was a difficult 2 weeks, late nights and lots of pressure, but it settled and worked very effectively. A final example was a civil rights lawsuit involving the city of Cincinnati, where a police officer accidentally shot an African-American, a black man, in the back as he was running away from the police. And there were riots. There was a great deal of conflict in the country, in the city. People were setting fires. Somebody shot a police officer in retaliation, and it hit his belt buckle. Otherwise, he might have died as well. The parties were looking at litigation. The Justice Department was involved in a civil rights lawsuit for police misconduct, and we feared that another trial might lead to even more riots, no matter what result would occur. So instead, the parties sat down with a mediator, and the police groups sat down, citizen groups, African-American groups, and the mediator got together and worked out a settlement, about 100 hours over a 2-week period, and they resolved the dispute to everyone's satisfaction. One final example of ADR in the government is found on the back of the U.S. dollar bill, which shows the newest version of the seal of the United States, which is found with the eagle. It's supposed to represent the United States, and you'll see that in its right talons are an olive branch, and its left talons are arrows, and there are 13 arrows in the left, 13 leaves on the olive branch in the right. In the original version of the seal, some years ago, the eagle's head was turned toward the left, where the arrows, supposed to represent war, the arrows of war are located. In about 1945, the President Truman had the head of the eagle turned. So instead of facing the arrows of war, it now faces the olive branch representing peace in its right hand, which is supposed to exemplify how the government should look first to peace and resolving its disputes, and ADR is an important part of that. Thank you.